My sister mocked me. "Where's your husband and kids? Oh, right, you don't." My parents laughed. That night, as I stood by the kitchen sink washing the last of the dishes from Mom's 60th birthday dinner, the mocking laughter still echoed in my ears, Emily's cutting voice layered over my parents' indulgent chuckles. "Where's your husband and kids? Oh, right, you don't have any." I clenched the sponge until soapy water dripped onto the floor, each drop a reminder that success, it seemed, meant nothing without a ring and a stroller. After years of scraping my way through law school, pulling 70-hour work weeks, and becoming one of the youngest partners at my firm, I was reduced to a punchline in my own home. I left that night without saying goodbye, letting the cold evenings swallow the warmth I once felt for them. But anger became fuel. I dove into work with a fire that burned through every sleepless night, every barely there meal. When I took on a high-profile investigation into embezzlement at a major tech company, I didn't expect the name of the CFO to be familiar. Mark Peterson, my brother-in-law. I went still as the file slid across my desk, typed words dripping with irony. I could have handed the case off, stayed clean, stayed safe. But revenge isn't safe. It's sharp as glass and just as fragile. I worked quietly, reviewing financial records late into the night, tracing hidden accounts, off-the-book transfers. The deeper I dug, the more clear it became. Mark was not alone in his dealings. Emily's signature was on several documents. Loans, shell companies. A life built on lies, far from the picture-perfect, Instagram-worthy family she flaunted. The same family used to belittle mine. I didn't smile. I didn't feel righteous. Just resolute. The day of the indictment hearing was gray, rain streaking the courthouse steps like the sky was crying for them. I sat across from Emily, her face pale, hands trembling. Mark stood beside her, jaw tight. Mom and Dad sat in the gallery, confused, terrified. I presented the case, every damning piece of evidence laid out like the truth they never wanted to hear. When the judge handed down charges, I didn't look at Emily. I looked at my parents. Their eyes avoided mine, finally seeing the light they'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. It wasn't triumph I felt in that moment. It was grief. I walked out of the courtroom alone, the door closing behind me like the final word in a chapter long overdue. Weeks passed before Emily called. Her voice was small, fragmented. "Why didn't you warn me?" she cried. I thought about everything she'd ever said, every time she and our parents had held my choices up like a mirror of failure. "Because you never listened," I wanted to say. Instead, I whispered a quiet truth. "I couldn't save you from what you built." I hung up before she could respond. I moved to a new apartment soon after, a place with tall windows and white walls, sunlight spilling across hardwood floors, a space finally free of shadows. One evening, I opened a bottle of wine, set down my phone, and watched the city lights flicker. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I was whole. Not in comparison to anyone, not in contrast to what I lacked, but because I'd stopped waiting for validation from those unwilling to give it. My revenge wasn't in their downfall. It was in reclaiming my story, in writing it without apology. In the silence that followed, peace settled beside me. Not loud, not triumphant, but quiet and profoundly mine. The reckoning. After the storm of the trial, life settled into a stillness that felt both unfamiliar and unsettling, like waiting for aftershocks. The media quickly moved on, but traces of the scandal still clung to every whisper in my hometown, where my family name had been both shield and curse. Emily's indictment was stayed, pending cooperation, and Mark was taken into custody on multiple federal charges. My parents didn't reach out, not with accusations, not with apologies, and the silence between us became a wall so tall and thick that for the first time in my life, I realized I had no need to climb it. I buried myself in work again, though the late-night hours felt less like escape and more like habit. But something shifted in me. I started to notice the empty spaces I'd been ignoring, the spare seat at my kitchen table, the unmatched wine glass in the sink, the way I still slept on one side of the bed. I began to wonder if, after everything I'd sacrificed, I was finally ready to want something more than survival. That realization came with a pang of fear. Being vulnerable meant risking rejection, but that fear was familiar and suddenly appeared smaller than it had been before. It was a late Thursday evening when my phone buzzed. A message from Jason Carr, a colleague back from a sabbatical. We'd always had a quiet rhythm, an almost relationship, derailed by timing. "Drinks this weekend?" it read. My first instinct was to decline, to retreat. But something in me, maybe the part that had learned the hard way that life didn't wait, typed back, "Yes." We met at a rooftop bar overlooking the city where the skyline shimmered against the setting sun. Jason was different, calmer, more grounded. He said, "I heard about what happened. You held your ground. I admire that." I shrugged. Sometimes survival doesn't feel like something to celebrate. He nodded. "Maybe that's because you've never been allowed to rest after winning." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The kindness in his voice was a solve I didn't know I'd needed. The night ended with a quiet walk, lingering goodbye, and a promise to try again. And for the first time, I believed I might deserve it. Days turned into weeks, and I started spending weekends without my laptop, letting myself be present in my own life. I went to art galleries, bought plants I learned to keep alive, even signed up for a pottery class. My hands, once only used to build cases and tear down facades, learned how to shape, mold, create. Each piece came out imperfect, but mine. On a Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. Mom. I stared at the screen, pulse accelerating. I let it ring. Then again. On the third call, I answered. "Maria?" Her voice was small, fragile even. "We want to talk. Your father and I." A beat. "We didn't know how to..." She trailed off, the apology unstated but heavy in the air. I stood in my sunlit living room, the walls soft with twilight. "I know," I said. There was a pause, full of everything that had ever gone unsaid. "Emily's struggling. She's with the kids. The trial?" Another trailing sentence. I closed my eyes. I could feel pity, even empathy, but not responsibility. I hope she finds a way forward, but I can't be the one to help her. Mom didn't argue. She just breathed, a small, weary sound. "We miss you." The words startled me. They were honest, even if they were late. "I'm still here, but not like before." We hung up, and I felt neither triumph nor guilt, just a subtle release, a quiet acceptance of a new truth. In the weeks that followed, I grieved what could have been, and then, slowly, it stopped hurting. I started planning a trip, alone, not as an escape, but as an experience. And on a crisp Saturday morning, I boarded a train to Vermont, my suitcase light, my heart lighter. In a little cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by quiet, I sipped coffee on a porch overlooking a lake. I thought about the girl that I'd been, seeking approval, aching for recognition, and I let her go. I wasn't done healing, but I was no longer defined by what I lacked. My solitude, once a weapon thrown at me by people too narrow to understand it, had become a space I cultivated, an echo of strength. One night, as rain pattered softly against the cabin roof, Jason called. "How's the escape?" I smiled. Not an escape, an arrival. And for the first time in my life, I meant it.
The return, Vermont gave me something I hadn't known I needed. Stillness. It peeled away the layers of noise I'd let settle over my conscience like dust, revealing a truth that had been there all along. I didn't have to be in pain to prove I was alive. When I returned to New York, the city felt different. The tension in my spine eased as I walked through the lobby of my building. No longer haunted by echoes of what I should be, I let myself embrace what I had become. I took up running in Central Park, letting each breath, cold and heavy in the morning air, carve space in my mind. I said yes more, to dinner with friends, to weekend trips, to Jason's easy smile. We weren't rushing. It was slow, deliberate, like building trust with a wild thing. One night at his apartment, a warm space filled with books, jazz humming low, and the smell of something spicy simmering in the kitchen, he reached for my hand and said, "You've changed." I laughed softly, but I knew he was right. I was no longer the version of myself always bracing for impact. I just stopped apologizing, I said, and he squeezed my hand in response. But healing has its own cycles. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Emily's. My chest tightened as I sat on my couch, unfolding the crisp paper. Her words were raw, bleeding with regret. She wrote of fear, of strangers judging her at school pickup, of the kids asking where their father went. She told me she wished she had listened, that she'd always been jealous of my freedom, my ambition, but had been too proud to say it. She'd resented me for choosing a path she never believed she could take. She ended by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, only that I might know she was trying to rebuild. I folded the letter back up and stared out the window, the city stretching endlessly below. I felt sadness, but not the piercing ache of old. Just a quiet ache for all the pain my family had passed around like an heirloom. I thought of calling her, but my phone stayed silent. Some bridges, once burned, are meant to stay ash. A week later, I found myself on the steps of my parents' house. I'd come alone, unannounced, not out of obligation, but resolve. The house looked smaller, worn, like time had finally left its mark. My mother opened the door, her face a map of exhaustion. We stood there long enough for the moment to stretch. Then she pulled me inside with a sob. My father sat in his armchair, newspaper untouched beside him. The room buzzed with unsaid things, but for once I wasn't afraid. We talked for hours, not about blame or apologies, but about now, how they were managing, how I was living. The cracks between us began to fill, not with plaster, but with truth. There'd be no perfect family portrait, no tidy resolution, but there was honesty, and in that, a fragile peace. When I left, I stayed in the driveway a moment longer, letting a gentle warmth seep into the hollow places. The next months brought more change. Emily took a plea deal and avoided prison time. She moved to a smaller town, started working part-time at a local library. She sent another letter, not asking, just updating. I chose not to respond, but I didn't ignore her either. I kept the letter, tucked neatly in a drawer, like a testimony that growth was possible, even if reconciliation wasn't. My career, once the center of my identity, became simply one part of my life. I started volunteering at a legal clinic, helping women trapped in cycles of financial abuse. I found purpose in helping others break free. Maybe because I had learned how to break my own chains. One day, I walked into the pottery studio, the scent of clay and dust settling like a familiar embrace. I signed up for an advanced class and thought of how far I'd come. The next evening, Jason met me at the museum. We stood before a sculpture of a woman, broken in places, but still standing. It felt like looking in a mirror. "You know," Jason said, the light catching his eyes, "you're not just surviving anymore." I smiled, feeling the truth of it settle into my bones. "No," I said softly, "I'm living." And with that, we stepped into the next room, letting the past stay behind us, not erased, not forgotten, but simply no longer in control. The quiet triumph. Spring arrived without warning, painting New York in hues of pale green and petals scattering like confetti on city sidewalks. I was sitting on the rooftop patio of my apartment building one evening, watching the sky bruise into twilight, when I realized something had shifted inside me. It wasn't loud or sudden, more like waking up one day and realizing a weight you'd carried for years was suddenly gone. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the breeze on my face, and thought about the tangled path that had led me here. How revenge had been a spark, but healing was the real fire. My life wasn't shiny or perfect. There were still nights when silence pressed in and memories crept back, uninvited. But those moments no longer unraveled me. They reminded me of everything I had overcome, of the girl who thought she had to earn her place in the world by ticking boxes and pleasing people who would never understand her. I was done shrinking, done apologizing, done waiting for someone to tell me I was enough. I was already enough, exactly as I was. The phone buzzed. It was a message from Jason. "Dinner at my place tonight? I made too much." I smiled, typing back a quick yes. The thought of someone cooking for me just because was something I still wasn't used to. But I was learning. We were learning together. The doorbell rang just as I was tossing on a jacket, but when I opened the door, it wasn't Jason. It was Emily. She stood there holding a small potted plant, a peace lily, its leaves glossy and green in the fading light. Her face was different, no longer drawn tight with comparison or hidden behind judgment. She looked tired, real. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She sat on the edge of my sofa, hands clutched in her lap. "I don't expect anything," she began. "I just wanted to say thank you." I raised an eyebrow. For what? For not destroying me, for not turning away completely, for holding me accountable. She looked up, her eyes wet but steady. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd lost trying to be what I thought I was supposed to be. I let her words settle. There was a time I would have fed off this moment, waited for it, needed it. But now it just was, a final thread tied in a story that no longer defined me. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. "I never did." Her breath caught. "Can we ever?" "Maybe," I said gently, "but not today." She nodded, stood, and placed the peace lily on my coffee table. "This is for your home. I hope it grows." And then she was gone. I stared at the plant, thinking of roots and new beginnings, of how fragile things can still survive if given the chance. I picked up my purse and headed out. Jason's apartment was full of music and garlic and laughter. He always left the door unlocked when he knew I was coming. I walked in and he looked up, a dish towel slung over one shoulder. "Hey," he said, smile spreading slow and wide. "Rough day?" I shook my head. "Just, a full one." He poured me a glass of wine and we settled onto the sofa, legs tucked under us like we'd done it 100 times. "Tell me everything," he said. And for once, I wanted to. I told him about Emily, about the peace lily, about how I'd been holding on to the past like a shield. He listened, really listened, without interruption or judgment. And when I finished, he leaned over and kissed the top of my head. "You're braver than you think," he murmured. The words didn't feel like praise, they felt like truth. After dinner, we sat on his balcony, watching the city hum below us. The air was warm, buzzing with the promise of new seasons. "Do you ever think about what's next?" I smiled. "I used to. I planned every minute like it was a deadline. But now?" I looked at him, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "Now I want to live it, instead of control it." He raised his glass. To that. We clinked, and the sound was soft, hopeful. Later, as I walked home, the streets thrummed with life. People laughing, cars rushing by, a dog barking somewhere in the distance. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. I felt whole. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, unlocked the door, and paused in the doorway to glance at the peace lily waiting on the table. It was a symbol, not of reconciliation forced or forgiveness demanded, but of a future that could be different if allowed room to breathe. I watered it before bed, and as I lay down, I realized I was no longer battling ghosts.
I had given them names, set them down, and walked away. My story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rising, not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove myself right. And in that quiet, in that softness, was the loudest triumph of all.